Years of bad policy decisions have led to the erosion of Tafe's critical role in Australia's education system. So how do we get here? And how can we restore Tafe's central role in improving education and employment outcomes for Australian workers? Hi, I'm Mark Dean. I'm Research Fellow at the Carmichael Centre at the Australia Institute.
Hi, I'm Lily Rains and I'm an Anne Cantor Fellow here at the Australia Institute. Hey Mark, can you tell me about the role of Tafe in Australia's education system?
Sure can, Lily. Well, Tafe is a critical provider of education in Australia. It adds around $3 billion per year to the Australian economy, but it also serves, and this is probably more important, as the most significant and accessible way that people connect between high school and employment. It also helps forge stronger economic and employment outcomes in regional areas of Australia, and so it creates opportunities for a lot of vulnerable sociocultural groups as well. And unfortunately, in recent years, particularly across the last decade, Tafe has been failed by bad policy decisions and major funding cuts. So a lot of poor quality private providers have entered the vocational education and training industry, or VET industry, and we've seen the number of apprenticeships collapse in this period as well.
Wow, so it sounds like it does contribute a lot of value. How does it do that?
Basically, overall, TAFE provides enormous public value to workers and communities all across Australia. It's at the very front of creating opportunities for people that are otherwise locked out of employment or who are experiencing insecure work. It also helps communities and industries adapt to changes, like providing new education and training opportunities when industries close and when workers are laid off from industry, such as in manufacturing when the closure of the auto plants happened in 2017. And it can do this because it's a trusted public institution. It has a clear role in society. What it does is it provides vocational education for all Australians that is low cost, it's often free, and it's connected to other student support services. And so VET education that's provided through TAFE leads to stronger employment outcomes as well. Basically, TAFE graduates are more likely to be employed when compared to both workers with less education than TAFE graduates, but also even workers with degrees from universities. So TAFE graduates earn more and find jobs easier than university graduates. Those with VET qualifications from TAFE have wages that are 39% higher compared with those whose highest educational attainment is year 12 or below as well.
But what about the cost of providing TAFE?
So basically, TAFE generates about $92 billion every year in the Australian economy, but the actual operation of TAFE is only $5.7 billion every year. So basically, TAFE's contribution to the Australian economy is about 16 times higher than what it costs to operate. And that's a huge difference. That means it makes a huge contribution to Australia's economy and doesn't really cost taxpayers anywhere near as much as private education does. And this size of its contribution compared to what it costs is just one way that proves that TAFE is really critical to Australia's economy in preparing workers for future jobs and actually building a lot of resilience amongst community members and communities that are struggling from crises in the economy. And so a perfect example of that is the current COVID-19 pandemic. And basically, this has compounded over the last couple of years just how important TAFE is to Australia's economy. But at the same time, over the last decade or so, TAFE has experienced a series of really bad policy decisions that have meant that it's had its funding cut and been mismanaged by the federal government's contribution to the sector.
And so what sort of policy decisions are you talking about here?
So, well, generally the TAFE system is being failed by bad policy decisions at federal and state government levels when it comes to education. First of all, since the early 2000s, the VET system has undergone a massive process of restructuring. It's become what we call a contestable model of funding. That's been produced for the system where basically private and for-profit training providers compete with the public non-profit institutions like TAFE for subsidies from taxpayers. So private for-profit providers are effectively taking public money and making a profit by delivering services in the VET sector that TAFE used to deliver for free. And this contestable model has seen private providers leaving students with much poorer quality outcomes or even no credentials whatsoever. So in order to police this system, VET uses compliance, but all this does is shift the focus of VET delivery from provision of quality education to meeting performance indicators that basically incentivize cost cutting and cutting corners, and even shortening the length of education that's provided to apprentices and trainees. So you can see how for-profit provision of what used to be delivered by the public provider TAFE actually leaves students worse off. So because I used to work at the Apprenticeships Information Service as a researcher, and that's like a federally education department funded thing. My boss was talking about how a lot of people get sucked into doing like funeral service jobs online, and that's impossible. You have to actually work in a funeral home so you can learn how to actually put, formaldehyde into cadavers and things like that. So people are doing it all online, having never set foot in a funeral service home, and they come out of the end of their 2 or 3 year training with no accreditation whatsoever. So that's the kind of thing that's being offered. These online private providers are just showing you how to do it, and then you're not getting any qualification from it.
Yeah, so these like private providers aren't putting in as much effort or genuine care into the education.
Yep.
So that kind of sounds like they're just churning out sort of certificates or churning out accreditation without meaningfully training people.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, this reminds me, I took one of those sort of, for-profit accreditation courses a few years ago for hospitality, and it had nothing to do with service or sort of genuine work. It was all about just sort of, creating itineraries up in a building for 6 hours a day that didn't go anywhere or connect or teach me anything.
Yeah, right. So you can see exactly how the actual provision of the so-called training is completely disconnected from actual work experience or actual experience in the industries that you would be seeking to find employment in. And so, had you have sought employment in those areas where you were so-called trained, you wouldn't probably look very good when, maybe on paper, but when you actually come to doing the job, then, they haven't taught you anything. And that's part of the problem.
And I'm sure that also sort of feeds into a vicious policy loop, right? Where they kind of point to, people aren't really coming out with meaningful training, so therefore it needs to be more for profit and less publicly funded.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail absolutely on the head. TAFE punches above its weight very clearly. But of course, it has been blamed for the failures of the private market for vet delivery. And these failed policy experiments with privatisation have threatened its sustainability. That's part of the problem. Even though TAFE hasn't been what's caused these erosions in quality in vet, it has been blamed for it because it's an easy target, and governments love to cut funding to public services. Yet at the same time, with all of this privatisation, it's making a huge lot of damage to Australia's skill base and the economy as we keep churning out people with experiences of creating tourism itineraries, but no actual experience in the tourism industry, to take your example to its logical conclusion.
Absolutely. And so is there any sort of way forward for TAFE, or is this sort of the cycle is going to perpetually be fighting for funding, failing the funding?
There are clear alternatives, and in order to reverse the damage that has been done to the vet system as a whole, it will require policymakers understanding just how important publicly provided vocational education is. Today, Australia's economy reaps an enormous flow of economic benefits from a house that was built by our TAFE system. Again, the $92 billion in annual productivity, income, tax and social benefits that it creates, and yet less than $6 billion that it costs to run. So the way that these private providers are profiting now is all because TAFE has built a solid foundation on which that can take place. And now governments seem to think that it's to blame for the errors that are taking place. And at the same time, all of these private for-profit providers of education and training run away with public money. And so creating better policy for the vet system means expanding access to vocational education, creating stronger pathways from education to work, and providing a more cohesive and coordinated post-school education system. And revitalising TAFE is the most important and reliable way to do this. TAFE becomes an anchor of vocational education and training, and for that reason, it has to be at the centre of Australia's post-COVID-19 reconstruction process. It's as simple as that.
So then, Mark, what's the ask of all of this? Like, what do we need to do to restore TAFE to its glory?
Yeah, well, basically, TAFE has to receive federal government funding, just like our schooling system. The billions of dollars in public funding that have been taken from VET since 2012 have to be restored. And at minimum, TAFE needs to receive 70% of total VET sector public funding, instead of that money being funneled straight to private for-profit providers. If we keep doing that, nothing is going to change, and TAFE is going to continue to be the poor cousin of an increasingly privatised VET system, and that isn't sustainable at all for Australia. So restoring that funding means that TAFE will help to rebuild our economy in the post-pandemic environment around a new VET funding model that makes distinct career pathways from school to work that rally around high-quality VET outcomes for apprentices and trainees. Publicly supported apprenticeships and traineeships should be expanded under this funding model so that everyone that wants to go into TAFE and have a career in a vocation has a direct pathway from school into employment opportunities through training.
Okay, so when we restore funding and investment in TAFE, we're also ensuring that our industries, communities, and governments are going to continue to reap the benefits of a productive and well-educated workforce for decades to come.
That's exactly right. Thanks for watching. To download the fact sheet that accompanies this video, go to carmichaelcentre.org.au.